Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Welcome again. In the last podcast, we were still in the words of Robert Creeley, which is like being in the words of thinking as writing, thinking as being as writing. I want to turn to a contemporary of Bob Creeley's, Barbara Guest. Barbara Guest is a poet who first came to some attention along with the so-called New York School poets that included John Ashbery, James Schuyler, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, David Shapiro, and eventually more poets. She was, at least in the first wave of that, the only female. And like others in that group, was very involved with contemporary art. And she has written about art in many essays. And I've been looking at one called The Shadow of Surrealism, and particularly a section of it which kind of goes from art to poem in a way that you may be able to understand that what she can do in a poem is very much a gestural, suggestive, indefinable kind of beauty creation that might be likened to what certainly some painters and some painters she loved were doing. So this is from the essay, The Shadow of Surrealism, which begins with her talking about, I grew up under the shadow of surrealism, which she calls almost magical rites of art. But she tracks that through abstract expressionism and other movements. And I want to read this moment where she says, I admired a painting of Matisse of a bowl of goldfish. I put a poster of this painting on my wall and looked at it daily. I began to realize very slowly that this great sensualist was also an intellectual manipulator of space who misled us by his concentration on color. How he treated his sensual interiors was a solemn intellectual problem. I was then working on a poem whose ostensible subject was 3 bodies of water, a pond, a swimming pool, and the sea. Giving the poem a title, Water Kingdoms, I submitted it to a magazine and the poem was rejected. With a sidelong look at the Matisse goldfish on the wall, I began to reconsider the poem. In the Matisse poster, the goldfish are placed in their bowl on a table. The table appears in another Matisse painting owned by the Museum of Modern Art. It is called the Rose Marble Table. I had cherished a fondness for this painting and had attached it to my life. Now I began to consider the table and became more intimate with the painting and progress of Matisse. The poem is called The Rose Marble Table. And I'll turn to that poem, which is a poem in stanzas, which range from 4 lines to 6 lines. And it, too, is like moving pieces around, like you might on a rose marble table. And those pieces include certainly the pool, the sea, the lake, emotive waters possessed by bodies, their octaves glide on marginal air, light weighing its touch here and thither to an arc of shapes and drips from wings. Couperin wades to his rock. Branches graze and sink, an unsettled stress pleads antic decline. Let the dead limb fall, imminence remains, arms flung into dirt alarms. Creative soul, you hesitate. I with my hand on the rose marble table, like you a difficult creature, ignoring the universe, igniting shadows, gulls over porches, bamboo familiars mine. Ultramarine is cold, it shivers until the scumbled white of foam distributes willfully from sea to lake to pond. We watch heads revel in occasional dips, while background thoughtful water frames Sistinas. They repeat a sobriety like a rose marble table. You can almost see how it is thinking about water, thinking about movement of water, thinking about movement of things, thinking about movement of ideas, allows the poet to come into possible statements, but the poem's not really about making statements. It's about pondering. It's about gesturing, even scumbling. When she says, until the scumbled white of foam distributes, I'm not even sure what scumbled is, but as I read it, I know absolutely what it is, that scumbling, distributing white foam. And the poem ends, supple nature declares texture, lends formality to words, a flight of marble can rearrange the speed of waters. We pass hands upon its surface and embrace the creative object. Throbbing waves fly over. And of course, that creative object we embrace may be waters, may be texture of some object, may be that arrangement of formality to words. It may be entirely within our mind. Guest is always both in the world, because our poetry is full of images, yet it's also full of pondering what these images are, and through that, how we are creatures of such pondering, and we come to, I think, understand ourselves in some ways insecurely, because we are always uncertain, just as the gesture that we make is always somewhat separate from meaning. In her work, Defensive Rapture, I wrote all over it, and once have a poem in my book, Pushing Water, actually the second volume of that, At the Edge of the Sea, which is composed entirely of my marginalia to Barbara Guest. So I won't read my marginalia here, but the book opens, Defensive Rapture, and I come to it. It's really the place where I began to embrace the work of this marvelous poet. First poet is Paulonia. And notice how at the beginning there are barely any verbs, so barely anything happening, yet within the language it is happening. There are no capitalizations here and no punctuation except for pauses that consist of long dashes, reminiscent of Emily Dickinson's dashes, but the poems are not quite like Dickinson poems, and periods in certain places at the end of a movement. So, ravenous the still dark a fishnet, robber walk near formidable plates, a glaze, the domino overcast. Seized by capes, budding splash whitened with strokes, silver tone gravure, knifed tree. There is a drama there. that followed at the very end of this section 1 of Pavlonia. Straw, beneficence, ambient cloud, riderless. Where the riderless echoes the first word of the poem, ravenous, also echoes beneficence, riderless. There aren't quite what we consider rhymes in here, but there is so much rich sounding of the language. I would probably, if reading it again, read it with a little more drama. Ravenous, the still dark of fishnet. Robber walk near formidable plates, aglaze, the domino overcast. Seized by capes, budding splash. Note that rhythmic correspondence. Seized by capes, budding splash. Whitened with strokes, silver tone gravure, where silver tone picks up on strokes. Knifed tree. Period there. Straw, beneficence, ambient cloud, riderless. Almost like after a tornado of language, you're left with something fairly calm, ambient cloud, riderless. I'm going to move on in this poem to, I think, all the way to the end of it. So you're not getting the entire poem. I don't have time for that. But I want to go through the end of the poem. So you have some sense of where it begins, where it ends, and some sense of the wondrous language of Barbara Guest. So this is after about 4 pages of this poem. The whinnied pupil scratch, anxious. From the stalk ear, the eye reached up, and the sublimated eye reroutes the gaze. World of trout, a neutralized shape. The portal earth through toad gaze on mottled dove, water outside the spoon. This is through the eye, through the ear, the way the mind, the sublimated eye, reroutes the gaze. And all the while, we in a world which is part of the animal environment, part of the green world, if you will, the portal earth, the world of trout, the toad gaze, the mottled dove, the water outside the spoon, not just water in a social setting, but water outside the spoon. And that water makes me also think of something that occurs early in the poem, vapor. Vapor is definitely water outside the spoon and is part of our being. Today, in a place with relatively high humidity, I feel that vapor. Guest's poem is not easy at all, but it is never uninteresting, never not full of things, action, life, the world. Just a little bit before the end of this poem, there's just a small section, 3 lines, which is, at the nib, dove shunted downward, survives in buoyant leap, admits the crater lump, the advance. At the nib, at the beginning, at the tip, and then we end with the advance. And this whole poem, and certainly this part, is a buoyant leap. I think the language that she comes to, I believe from observation, leads to the movement of the poem. I think of Barbara Guest as an artist speaking inside the poem, from the inside, not from a point of having something the poet wants to tell us, but from a point of being inside the world, learning from it, and taking us there with her. Barbara Guest, highly recommended. Thank you for listening.
1, 2, 3.